Doctor Who Season by Season. Season 15 Review. Season 15 of Doctor Who was broadcast from late 1977 to early 1978. It was the fourth season to star Tom Baker as the Fourth Doctor and the second to star Louise Jameson as his savage companion Leela. Robert Holmes returned as script editor for the first half of the season before handing over to Anthony Reid. Season 15 was also the first season to be produced by Graham Williams. I will put my cards on the table right now and say that, unlike many of the more miserigged humorless wanker elements of Who fandom, Graham Williams is hands down my favorite producer and his era my overall favorite. Does that mean that season 15 is up there with the best? However, the season begins with Horror of Fang Rock, which is the televisual equivalent of Graham Williams taking Philip Hinchcliffe to a karaoke bar and singing "Anything You Can Do, I Can Do Better at Him." Or, as well as, anyway. Fang Rock, written by former script editor and Who stalwart Terrance Dicks, is a claustrophobic horror story very much in the mold of the previous era and indeed every bit as good as that era's highlights. It's superbly written, made and acted, full of great dialogue, fantastically spooky music and just an all-round great atmosphere. I love this story and in fact it is easily one of my top 10 favorite stories of all time. Fang Rock is an absolute classic and one that gets season 15 off to an absolutely fantastic start. The next story is The Invisible Enemy, which does not exactly continue the quality of the previous story. Written by 70s Who stalwarts Bob Baker and Dave Martin, not exactly my favorite Who writers and ones who are pretty inconsistent in terms of their stuff being good or bad almost at random, and this isn't one of their better efforts. To be fair, it starts off pretty well and episode 1, while a bit on the cheap side, is actually pretty effective and atmospheric as the crew of a moon base start getting taken over by a sentient alien virus. It starts going downhill when they get to the space station in episode 2, and when it starts going full on the Fantastic Voyage homage, it goes spectacularly tits up and gets very silly and simultaneously dull. Aside from episode 1, the only real bright spot of The Invisible Enemy is the introduction of one of the show's greatest and most unique companions, the iconic robot dog K9, here voiced by the great John Leeson, who voiced him for all his seasons except for season 17, where David Brierley took over. There are a number of Who fans who hate K9, and you can probably guess what I think of these miserable fuckers. K9 is one of the show's great icons and it's a credit to Williams' genius that, although the character was created as a one-off by Baker and Martin just for this story, the producer immediately spotted his potential to be a regular part of the show and a massive appeal for the child and family audience. I make no apologies, I fucking love K9, though I've no time for any of these redesigned modern bollocks scrapula Baker's been trying to market him in. Fuck off with that shit, frankly. The next story is Image of the Fenn, which happily gets things back on track again. Although this isn't as good as Fang Rock, and indeed I reckon it's probably the weakest of the three scripts by Chris Face of Evil and Robots of Death Boucher, with some uncharacteristically clunky dialogue, I still like it rather a lot. It's superbly made with some wonderfully atmospheric direction, the monsters are creepy and cool, and many of the guest characters are great, particularly the very likable Adam Colby and the hilarious Granny Tyler, the old wise woman who goes all Danny Glover in the last episode by noting that she might be getting too old for this shit. The next story is The Sunmakers, by departing script editor Robert Holmes. This is Holmes doing full-on comedy, though Talons comes close at times, for the first time since The Time Warrior, and is utterly brilliant. I reckon The Sunmakers is one of the most underrated stories in the history of the series, with the dreary old fan criticisms of the drap sets spectacularly missing the point as ever, given Pluto is supposed to be a pretty drab and depressing, and totally overlooking the fantastically clever and witty script. Sunmakers is a riot, and if anything its satire on taxation and the corporate takeover of absolutely bloody everything is more prescient and pointed today than it was back in the late 70s. As with Fang Rock, this is another of my all-time favorite stories. The penultimate story of the season is Underworld. 2 stories by Bob Baker and Dave Martin in the same season is not exactly something to celebrate, and Underworld manages the unenviable feat of being worse than The Invisible Enemy. Far, far worse in fact. Indeed, following one of my top 20 or even 10 favorite stories comes one of the absolute worst, at least for classic Who, and almost certainly the worst story of the Tom Baker era. Underworld is clobbered by budget, with the production team quite literally running out of money for cave sets and having to film around half the story with a CSO back projection that looks about as awful and unconvincing as you'd imagine back projection on late 70s television could look. That being said, the horrible CSO is hardly even the biggest problem with it. The story is just plain boring as fuck. Indeed, I have never managed to make it past episode 3 without falling asleep or reaching for the remote. Even Tom can't make this watchable, and that's saying something at this point. The final story of the season is The Invasion of Time, a 6-part story written under a pseudonym by Anthony Reed and Graham Williams after another story fell through at the last minute. They'd commissioned a 6-part Gallifrey story from a respected writer, only to have him defer delivering the scripts again and then drop them on them at the last minute, only for them to find they were insanely overambitious and completely fucking unfilmable on Who's budget. Thanks a bunch for nothing. So The Invasion of Time was written in a blazing rush, and it often shows, particularly in the last 2 episodes, which are largely just a chase around the TARDIS, whose interior looks remarkably like museums and leisure centers. And yet for all the problems, The Invasion of Time is actually rather good. It's no deadly assassin by any means, but nor, thank fuck, is it Arc of Infinity. Basically the Doctor seems to go bonkers and helps a bunch of tinfoil aliens invade his home planet so long as he gets to be president while they're in charge. Of course, nothing is as it seems, but this is a pretty neat premise, and Tom is on great form as a seemingly even more batshit crazy 4th Doctor than normal. The characters are fun too, such as the new Borusa, the creepy Castellan Selna, and Rodden, a stuffy time lady who comes across very much as a proto-Romana. I like her, and so does Leela, clearly. Leela leaves in this story, rather unfortunately, and while much criticism has been expressed of the rushed nature of her departure and the way she apparently falls in love with dopey Gallifreyan guard Andred and leaves to be with him, I think it's quite obvious that that's not really what's happening. She hardly spends any time with him after all. No, it's quite obvious that she's madly in love and lust with Rodden, and vice versa, but since neither 70s tea-time TV nor Gallifreyan society was ready for that kind of thing, she decides to use Andred as her beard while keeping Rodden as her main squeeze. That suits Andred, after all, who also needs a beard, quite clearly. Trust me on this, folks, there was some serious girl-on-girl action going on Gallifrey that night. Overall, season 15 is the weakest season of the Williams era and very much a rather up and down transitional season between the style of the previous era and the style of the new one. Nonetheless, it's got my favorite Doctor on fabulous form along with one of my favorite companions and 2 of my top 10 most loved stories of all time. I really can't give it anything less than a B+.